It's Judy Ridner, Brooke, tell me your last name. Farley, Hillary Richardson, and we're here interviewing Boyd Gatland, and it's May 19th, 2016. So Boyd, as I told you, what we usually start with is just some general information about your background. So can you tell us where you were born and who your parents were and a little bit about your family history and kind of who you are?
Sure. I was born only 30 miles from here in Louisville, Mississippi. Kind of happenstance because my parents at the time were both teaching at French Camp Public Schools, but they had a farm in rural Choctaw County, and they spent their summers there. I think at the time my father was waiting to see if he was going to be drafted. This was 1945, and Louisville had the nearest hospital. When I decided to come calling, that was where they went to be delivered. I don't remember anything about it, obviously. That was August 13, 1945, and of course my father was not drafted because the war ended shortly thereafter. I don't think I had anything to do with that, but it's always something to consider. I went to school the first 3 grades in French Camp Public Schools. Part of that at the time, my father was principal, which was, even for a second grader, was a little bit awkward. Felt a little bit awkward. We lived in about 3 miles from the town of French Camp on my grandfather's old farm, my mother's parents. After 3rd grade, we moved to Madison, Mississippi, which at the time was a town of about 200 or 300 people. My father was elected mayor shortly thereafter, and he served, I think, a 2-year term. I started the 4th grade there and went through the 9th grade. We had to move at the time because my father lost his job when the Coleman administration ended, and Ross Barnett was elected, and Barnett fired him to his later regret, and he ended up publicly apologizing for it, but nevertheless the deed was done. And then we moved to Forest, Mississippi, where I went 3 years of high school. Between my junior and senior year, due to encouragement and pressure from my guidance counselor, I came to Mississippi State to a summer science program that was funded by NASA, or the National Science Foundation, I believe it was, maybe both of them. And so that kind of put bulldog blood in me, and even though I had a small scholarship offer to the University of Mississippi, I came to Mississippi State in the fall of 1963. I was an indifferent student, got interested in the campus newspaper, and then in my sophomore year I volunteered my services to the Reflector, the student newspaper, as a reporter, and also wrote a column. Now this was the fall of 1964, presidential election year. I was not eligible to vote, of course, but I wrote the column on the conservative side. I believe we had 2 columns, one called From the Right Bank and the other one From the Left Bank, or something similar to that. And I'm still in touch with the person who wrote the other column, by the way. He's a retired professor at Delta State University, and who might be able to contribute to this project. In any case, in those days, the editor of the Reflector was popularly elected. And there were 3 of us who ran, and I won without a runoff because I ran on a platform of conservatism. Not that there were any, quote, liberals around at the time, but nevertheless, I emphasized my basic political conservatism. I grew up in a home with parents who were products of Mississippi culture at the time. The N-word was forbidden in our house. So to that extent, I learned some degree of tolerance from a very early age. As I matured, and maintaining my political conservatism, I never felt that among my peers, never felt that I had the same racial attitudes as they did. But I kept my mouth shut for the most part. When I ran that spring of 1965, as I said, I ran on a conservative platform, defeated my 2 opponents. And then that summer of 1965, I worked at the local radio station, WSSO, as the local reporter, covering town hall, city board of alderman meetings, county supervisors, that kind of thing, and Mississippi State. And of course, in July of 1965 is when Richard Holmes enrolled as the first African American in Mississippi State. And interestingly, we had always heard throughout, after the unfortunate, sad events at Ole Miss, that, boy, just wait till they tried at Mississippi State with all those rednecks up there. Well, of course, it was almost a non-event when Richard Holmes enrolled here. I, in fact, was not able to go to the news conference because I was in class. And summer school is a time you don't want to miss a class. Mm-hmm. But so one of my colleagues at the station covered it, but there was not much to cover. Well, there was no Reflector during the summer. When we began to publish in the fall, the first thing that came to my mind from the standpoint of news was, what are we going to do about Richard Holmes, my first black student? And so I assigned a reporter, and I couldn't tell you who it was, to find him and interview him. To the best of my memory, Richard basically said, I'd like to be left alone. And so that's exactly what we did. We left him alone. We never called attention to him in any way in the Reflector. Now, as the new Reflector editor, my major project was to transform the newspaper from a large weekly format to twice a week in a tabloid format. The word tabloid, I know, has a bad connotation, but it really just is a description of the size, not to the content. And so that format basically still survives until now. Rather naively, I thought, well, we'll go twice a week in the fall, and by spring we'll go daily. I soon learned that twice a week was hard enough to do. And going daily was completely out of the question. I spent most of my energies just making that transition. We went into an entirely new technology. And by the way, the documents which I generated during that transition, all of which had to be approved by the administration, by the way. I at one point donated to the library. I'm not sure how many of them had survived, but all my proposal is somewhere in the library. The cost of devoting all my attention, or most of my attention, to technical issues resulted in my not being sufficiently engaged with editorial content. I think for the most part our staff members, many of whom were not Mississippians, shared most of my views, which at the time would have been considered quite liberal, if not radical. Mm-hmm. In the fall of 1965, the President D.W. Colbert, signed some kind of compliance pledge with the federal government, for which he took a lot of flack from the powers in Jackson. And I think it was probably overwhelmingly approved. His actions were approved by the student body because they had a lot of confidence in Dr. Colbert. But the Reflector editor at that time was automatically a member of the Student Senate, and I introduced a motion of commendation from the Student Senate to President Colbert for doing that. I had a friend in the Senate who agreed to second the motion and to argue in favor. Well, she abandoned me completely. And not only did the Senate reject it, they struck it from the minutes and almost dared me to put it in the reflector.
And can I ask you about what was so Colvard signed an agreement, I assume, to comply with federal guidelines for desegregation? Is that what you think it was?
I think that was it, yes. I don't remember the details. I corresponded with him a little bit right before his death. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that correspondence ended before we were able to work out what it was. And I don't think that I have any written record of what it was, but it was a contentious issue. He tried to do it quietly, as he tried to do everything. I can't imagine the desegregation having been handled more efficiently and with more dignity than he did. I don't know to what extent he communicated with Dr. Connor, but I'm personally convinced there was a lot of preamble to the enrollment.
And so your implication is that perhaps Colvard and Connor were sort of working behind the scenes so that Colvard was setting up perhaps a situation where there wouldn't be a lot of contention when Holmes and
that was my impression. I have absolutely no evidence to back that up. But that's the way that Dr. Colvard worked, was to work quietly behind the scenes to make difficult decisions and processes easier. That's the way he handled the infamous basketball game with but unfortunately we lost Dr. Colvard at the second semester. Dr. Giles became president between semesters, and Dr. Giles had many of those characteristics of just quiet dignity and just superb people skills.
Now, when you brought the motion of commendation, if I understand this correctly, this would have been to, again, praise Colvard for his willingness to do this. Exactly what were you sort of commending him on?
We were commending him for signing the document to avoid any repercussions that might have occurred. And I think I used the words so that we can demonstrate to the rest of the world that we are intelligent, law-abiding citizens.
And do you, thinking about the reaction of like the student senate to that, clearly this was, as you said, contentious issue. Do you have any sense of what the student body then thought about this? If they didn't want to commend him, they, as you said, they wanted this all struck from the minutes. So what's the mood like on campus?
I did a survey, not a professional poll. I think I did it personally, of random students about the compliance signature. And as I recall, it was almost overwhelmingly a sentiment of approval. I think that what the Senate did not want was any kind of written record to draw attention to their approval or disapproval. They really just didn't want to vote on it. I think that's what it came down to.
Why do you think that's so?
I don't know. Their attitude seemed to be, well, he did what he had to do. There's no point in praising him for it or drawing attention to it. He just did what he had to do. He did the right thing, perhaps, but maybe not for the right reasons.
Okay. And can I ask you too, I'm going to go back a little bit. You had a real interesting quote earlier where you said that you never had the same racial attitudes that they did, talking about many of your fellow students. And it sounds like also some of the people that you grew up with. Can you give us a sense of how your attitudes were different than other people? Because clearly at the time you came here, you were, as you said, you ran on a conservative platform to be elected to head the Reflector, and you were writing the conservative column, and you came from it sounds like mostly conservative, you know, typically kind of Mississippi conservative background. So then how do you end up, where do you see, or how can you explain those differences in attitudes, and what are some of those differences?
I read a lot. And then as editor of the Reflector, I had access to newspapers from all over the U.S. They were sent complimentary. But I think there was some parental influence that you don't hate people. And as I said, my parents were a product of their environment, and today we would normally call them racist. And perhaps that's justifiable. But at the same time, we treat people well, regardless of who they are.
And it sounds like your father he was a principal, you said? So he obviously was college educated,
Both my parents were college educated. My mother's degree was a 2-year degree, but that was not uncommon. She was very unusual in the sense that she graduated from French Camp Academy, which I don't think had that name at the time, and then went to a 2-year college, Mississippi Synodical College in North Mississippi, which was, I believe, under the auspices of Presbyterian Church, and which later became Belhaven. It was to some extent a finishing school, but also she had a good education, because I remember one time she was reading us a story and she was stumbling a lot as she read, and I wondered why, and then I found out the book was in French. She was reading to us in English. But after my older brother was born, by the way, I am the third child. I have two brothers and one sister. I think that she devoted her time to raising us. My dad didn't stay in education very long. He went 1 year to Mississippi State and then transferred to Delta State Teachers College, and then went immediately into a principal's job. And my parents met at the office of the Choctaw County Superintendent of Education, and they were married, believe it or not, in Starkville, Mississippi in 1936. So my mother, believe it or not, you have to understand that she grew up on a little farm of 160 acres out from French Camp, which in itself is a village. And by the time they married in 1936, she had her own car. Very unusual for a woman at that time.
Right.
So, I attribute some of my attitudes of tolerance and then, to their influence. But I considered myself, even in high school, as what I would call a states' rights conservative. But I always separated that from the race issue, which other people didn't. And I remember speaking up in history class. These are not the same thing. Not the same thing at all. And I don't think they accepted that. That was the primary issue. I always contended that our state's, infatuation with states' rights was more infatuation with segregation than with any other kind of right of the state. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah. So, but it sounds like too, listening to you talk about your college experiences, that your political and social views on race were evolving very much while you were here. And
that's correct. for sure.
Yeah, and so, and clearly it sounds like was it the newspaper? It was the newspaper job that really was doing that? Were there other influences doing that?
Obviously, something happened between May of 1965 and September of 1965 in terms of my attitude. Now, I did spend the summer doing two things: editing the Bulldog Handbook and working at WSSO. And I suppose that I had contact with, you know, for example, Dr. Connor and other African American leaders in Starkville in my role as a reporter. But I don't remember any single incident that might have influenced me. I did get one lesson in racial tolerance at a very young age, and I'll never forget the details, but it was at Madison, Mississippi, so I was, what, 10? I had a brand new bicycle, which I bought with my own money, and was riding late, like dusk, had my light on, and met a family of African Americans walking down the street in the opposite direction. I had a little bulb horn on my bicycle. And so as we got closer and closer, they were spread out. I honked and honked a little bit more, and nobody moved. Now this was a shock for me. I clearly must have expected them to get out of my way. They didn't. And instead, the father intercepted me physically, very kindly and in a fatherly manner. He said, "Son, we don't run over people." I was taken aback, but it was a very important lesson to me.
I understand. Do you remember about, like you mentioned that Dr. Connor, who I'm sure, well, you know too, Dr. Connor looms large in the whole story of Starkville and its civil rights movement. Do you remember anything about him from your time working at WSSO?
I remember he was a man of great dignity, and did not seem to have a chip on his shoulder toward white people, particularly an upstart young reporter. He treated me like the professional I wanted to be. I don't have any particular memories one way or another about topics that we discussed, and my contact was pretty limited. I did talk to him on the phone along with the manager of the station, the radio station, when I think the manager of the station may have gotten a call from him or from somebody as a tip that this was about to happen, that he was about to enroll. And so I was able to interview him over the telephone before all this, the registration actually occurred. So that's one reason I really didn't need to go to the news conference, because I'd already talked to Dr. Connor and knew what was going to happen.
Do you have any memories of what he said or how he presented this?
He gave me history, you know, where he'd come from and where he'd, like, going to Wiley in Marshall, Texas, and that kind of thing. So I had background. And I was under the impression he was actually his biological father at the time, and because he was just routinely referred to as Dr. Connor's son. And then finally, I guess because of the difference in name, got that straightened out. I don't think that he was ever adopted. I think he was more of a foster child.
That's what he's told us, yeah. But there's been a fair amount of confusion, because he is indeed portrayed typically as Dr. Connor's son.
Right.
And he is, but he isn't. So, Brooke, do you think about the newspaper issues, since we've been talking a lot about kind of your college years and the work on the Reflector, do you have some questions too that you want to jump in with and add about the newspaper and stuff that you've read in the newspaper? Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I was wondering about any internal conflicts that you had with VSA, student association and all that. Like I noticed that you didn't always get along. Were there ever any instances where you would post anything regarding race or just the student thoughts on campus that the SA didn't like, or did they ever try and censor you by any means?
It was clear to me that there were quite a few people in the Senate who would have liked to have gotten rid of me. But nobody ever said anything threatening in that regard. I did have a high school friend who was in there, and he came to me in confidence, said that the feeling is that you have proprietary feelings toward the Reflector. You think it's yours instead of it belongs to the students and it's our publication, and that you should be reflecting that in the editorial content. And actually, we did not dwell editorially on the race issue that I recall very much. We did spend a lot of time on just individual rights in general, and we did get bogged down in some cases here on campus having to do with due process and how students were treated when they were sent to the dean for some sort of misbehavior, whether it be a parking ticket or alcohol or whatever. We brought in outside help, legal help, and the outcome of that was that at one point President Giles was, as I recall, threatened with jail time if he didn't show up for a hearing to show cause. And by then I was gone. That my tenure had ended, and I had already moved on to Southern Mississippi and worked at WDAM in the news department there and went to Southern. It was only later in 1976 that I came back to Mississippi State and majored in engineering, and then went all the way through to get a PhD. But I just don't remember dwelling a lot on racial issues. Women's rights, it's interesting that if you were to do a search on some newspaper index, sometime, it must have been in the early 70s, United Press International decided to do a national survey on women's studies across the country. Well, Dr. Giles had already seen that Mississippi State had a women's studies program in the 70s. And so I got a phone call from UPI. At the time, I was what we refer to as news editor in what then was called public information, what it's called now, Sid Salter's department.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did all the news releases, wrote all the feature stories. It was a small operation. So I fielded the phone call. And apparently I was one of maybe 2 or 3 who were willing to respond to this question. And so this story showed up all across, from coast to coast, with my being given about 3 paragraphs of quotation about how we already have such a program, this is a non-issue, etc., etc.
What was the question that they asked you?
I'm sorry?
What was the question that they asked you, UPI?
What is the status of women's studies on your campus?
Oh, okay.
And I didn't realize it had gotten such wide circulation until in my genealogical work I had done a search on my last name. And here it pops up, and I see it, it's in the Salt Lake City newspaper, it's in the Atlanta newspaper, it's in Oregon. I thought, wow. But yeah, we did spend a lot of time on lambasting in loco parentis, which is a fancy term for college administrators acting like parents. That was a big issue then, and I don't know. Perhaps we saw race in higher education in Mississippi as a non-issue now. and we just expected that.
So, and when you say a non-issue now, we expected that, what exactly?
We expected that we would continue to see enrollment by black students. That it was a done deal. And of course, to some extent it was. It was all smooth from there on, as far as I know. There were isolated incidents, I know, and there were incidents downtown which were unpleasant that I was only vaguely aware of, because much of that time from 66 through 68 I was away. I came back in 1968 to work for the university in public relations.
And you went, so it sounds like you didn't, the first time you didn't actually graduate from Mississippi State.
That's correct.
But you went on, and now what made you change and go different directions?
Well, I worked for 2 years at the University of Tennessee doing marketing and PR for a big federal research project. And all of the people I worked with and for were all engineers, and they encouraged me to do that, and so that's what I did. And while finishing up my BS, I met my current wife, who was on the faculty in physics, and by the time I got my master's degree, she had tenure. And all this makes moving rather difficult. And so I stayed on, and then after that, after getting a PhD, we were all ready to move, had job offers, and then we were made offers we couldn't refuse to stay here. And so that's why I've spent most of my life in Starkville. I would have to go back and review reflectors from 65, 66 to really recall how much space we devoted to race issues.
Yeah, but your memory is that it's not that much.
The Vietnam War, of course, we spent a lot of time talking about the Vietnam War and the draft. That and women's rights, and those issues kind of overshadowed any racial issues that came up.
Do you have other questions? Not really. You said it yourself, the Vietnam War and just student rights, that was really prevalent during that time, and so you didn't see that much on civil rights. So that was rather interesting during that time. I don't think I ever saw from 65 to 70 any mention of Richard Holmes except when he sent in a letter to the editor.
He was about as close to a perfect first enrollee of the African American race as we could have had, in my opinion. I think I've only met him once when he was a student here, and never had an extended conversation with him.
And when you say perfect, what do you mean?
Well, he was a gentleman. He was quiet. He's certainly not the kind of personality that would antagonize people who might otherwise have been antagonized. He didn't come with an attitude.
Which kind of leads me, and this is a question that's based upon like lots of conversations we've had with people. Why do you think Mississippi State and Starkville and so many of the people involved were so interested in doing things quietly? And you're not the only one who has used the term quiet. Do you have any sense of why that is? Like, why did things like desegregation go more smoothly here? Why was Richard Holmes the sort of quiet, respectable, not kind of in your face person that is very different than some other campuses in this state? Do you have any sense of why that's so?
I would think that the tragedy at the University of Mississippi was just a powerful lesson that And the university was fortunate to have just really good leadership, and the two presidents, Colbert and Giles. We really could have, had a much more difficult time under different leadership.
Some of the things that we've read and the people that we've talked to have said that they were glad also that it was quiet, but maybe one of the unintended consequences was that it took longer, especially maybe not so much with the with Richard Holmes integrating, but with the public schools in Starkville and just other issues involving race, like voting rights and things like that. They just didn't happen in a timely manner. Do you have any sense of that, or is that something that you've noticed, or have you?
Well, I really can't speak to to Starkville that much. Our daughter went to Starkville High School, and at the time, I don't know about now, at the time we thought it was quite a good school. And she had quite a few friends of both races. As to why things took longer, I think in terms of enrollment at MSU, Dr. Colbert wanted to make sure it was done right. And whether or not Richard Holmes was handpicked and recruited, I don't know. Mm-hmm. If he was, then it was a perfect job.
Mm-hmm. When did your daughter attend Starkville High?
She graduated in '01.
Okay. She might have had another one of our interviewees for English teacher, Miss Early Fleming.
Don't remember the name.
Okay. She taught at Starkville High and previously at Henderson High, mm-hmm. when it was at the black high school, and did a little jumping around, but ended up at Starkville High. A few people that work in the library with me had her for English. Yeah.
I don't remember who many of her teachers were.
So thinking too about coming back here in the 70s, where you were, right, oh, it's 68. 68, okay. 68, and from 68 on, then you were here.
Well, no, I left. Nope. I left in '74 for the University of Tennessee, and was there for 3 years.
Okay, and then came back here again to go
into engineering.
Yeah, and then you went on to get your PhD, and then became a faculty member. Yeah. So it was like from 70.
Well. Continuously from 76, except for one academic year at Duke University when I was on sabbatical. When I came to Mississippi State in 1962, I think I had been to Alabama and Tennessee, extended my travels in the world. And one of the first things that I was able to do as a new editor was to go to the Student Publications Conference in San Francisco. So I'd never been on an airplane before, and my first experience was just to fly to San Francisco.
Yeah, totally different. Yeah. Yeah.
Quite an experience for somebody from Little French Camp.
Yes, absolutely. Do you remember when you came back in especially in the 70s, had things changed on campus, and if so, how? Did you notice more African American faces? Did you notice a different, what if anything had changed?
Well, there were definitely more black faces. I mean, I went to engineering, and I had, here I am, 30-year-old, and I'm an undergrad again, and I had, there were a few African Americans in the class that I had, although at the time there were probably fewer in engineering than there were percentage-wise in the university at large, but that has changed over the years. It was different, for sure. But I knew, because having been at the University of Tennessee and seeing that kind of environment, in another southern SEC school. You know, what had transpired, and they're not that different from MSU.
Was there anything different about just the general feel of had the campus itself changed? Do you think that the feel of the campus was any different in the 70s than it had been when you were, because when you were here in the 60s, you were here mid-60s, pretty turbulent time overall in the US.
Yes.
I mean, civil rights movement is really going strong. It's moving elsewhere, it's very much kind of cropping up elsewhere in the country. You've got the Vietnam War, you've got sort of the hippie culture kind of starting to come out. And then you go to the 70s, had anything changed in that decade almost? You had sort of come in the middle of one decade, you kind of came back the middle of the next decade.
Well, sure. It didn't seem like the same place. For one thing, there were a lot more women enrolled.
Oh.
A lot more. I don't remember what the female enrollment was in 1965, but it was not very big. And I had no sense of what the percentage of black students was. I was in the business of passing my courses and didn't pay much attention to those sorts of issues at the time. So I really can't say, or I can't say with any certainty how things had changed, but of course I was 10 years older too, so my point of view was different.
Yes.
What about, you spent a long time on campus after that as a faculty member.
Right.
Your perspective had changed a lot by then, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Did it continue just in a trajectory that it had started on, or, I don't know, looking back from that perspective, what would be different?
Well, first of all, yes, I've experienced Mississippi State as an undergraduate student, a graduate student, a staff member, and a faculty member.
Yeah.
That's the whole spectrum.
Right, that's the whole gamut, right. Yeah.
Now the campus has changed so much physically just since I retired about 12 years ago. I can't find my way around here anymore because the landmarks have all changed. But I don't have a feel for what the student body is like now. And when I was on the engineering faculty, I didn't interact with, I had no reason to interact with fraternities, and I certainly wasn't dating students or anything like that. So I don't know that I could address that with any confidence. But it all seems to have been smooth, maybe slow.
Mm-hmm.
I think in many respects we were always at least 5 years behind in terms of clothing trends or anything else. I have pictures of myself made in the 70s, and my friends from other parts of the country would sure those from the 60s. Everybody else had abandoned bell bottoms by then. What are you doing with them all?
I understand. Well, I'm thinking about some of the people whose names you gave us who worked with you on the Reflector. Do you have any sense of what their backgrounds were? Like, were most of the people you went to school with in the 60s also like you from mostly rural farm, parents from rural farm backgrounds? Do you have any sense of who worked with you? Like, what was kind of the demographic of the people who worked with you on the Reflector?
Well, I did have quite a diverse staff. And one very talented reporter who had worked professionally from Canada. One of the most talented writers was a woman who had worked at the Delta Democrat Times and later spent an entire career there. She was from Greenville, Mississippi, and Greenville is certainly bifurcated very strongly, and so she was a fan of Hod and Carter, so that automatically meant she didn't fit in. And I think there were probably some staff members who wanted to do the work, and so they just kept their mouths shut if they thought editorially we were too radical for their taste. Never had anybody quit and say, this is a liberal rag, I want out of here. But they were from small towns, but another very talented writer was a veteran, a man originally from Mississippi, but he had spent a lot of time in the military, and so attitudes were completely different from the typical Mississippian.
So it sounds like not all of your staff was the traditional 18 to 22-year-old college
Absolutely
student.
not.
Yeah.
First of all, the work was pretty demanding, and we paid a little bit, but it was mostly just the reward of seeing your work in print. And sometimes when things get, during finals week and things like that, that's not reward enough for a lot of people. And then we had all the technical issues that I alluded to with the transformation. I think the Reflector, at least in those days, attracted an atypical group of people. I don't know about now. And of course, now the editor is chosen by based on qualifications rather than popular vote, which is of course appropriate. I don't know when that changed, but it was a good change. Because quite frankly, I had no experience. I just
ambitious.
Got the job and made the best of it.
I understand. Now, did you all have any real conscious conversations about the political tilt of the paper, or was that just something that kind of naturally evolved? How did you, like you've talked a couple times about, some people might have said it was a liberal rag. Well, was there any sort of conscious conversation among all of you on the paper about which way consciously you were tilting or not tilting the paper politically?
We might have had informal discussions over beer. That would have been the extent of it.
Yeah.
We didn't have formal staff meetings. Usually, I had separate staffs for the two papers, simply to spread the workload. And I don't know to what extent they do that now, but it worked at that time. But sometimes we used canned editorials, particularly if I had nothing to say and nobody else had anything to say, or if it were a particularly busy week academically.
And so where they would come off what? One of the...
Well, there were services.
okay.
I think... I don't remember the names, but there were a couple of services that provided not only commentary from noted authors, but also, news from other campuses, which is always relevant, a little bit of it. We probably use too much of it, but because we had to have, let's be honest, we had to have filler sometimes.
And two papers.
Yeah. So, and as I said, the being able to read the Miami Herald and the Seattle Times and the Chicago Tribune was informative for me, and we made them available to anybody who wanted to read them on the staff.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about that we haven't asked, that we may not even know to ask you, that you think you want to address?
Well, I will say that my time in public relations, at times there was tension between my superiors and me, because some of the things I wrote were gave them heartburn. Some of my feature stories, because I managed to to seek out people with students with alternative points of view, long hairs, and with a picture. So I was more like a reflection editor when I was doing PR in some sense than I was when I was actually running the newspaper, because I did make an effort to expose aspects of the university which the administration probably would prefer not be emphasized. And of course, we did not do sports, but occasionally I would write, a feature story on an athlete. If they were interesting people outside of. But in that position, someone said, you probably know more about what's going on at the university than the president does, because it was my business to know. All kinds of documents and minutes across my desk so I could keep up to date. But no, I think I've said quite enough, actually.
Do either of you have other questions like Brooke, do you have anything that you...
You mentioned sports. Do you know, or did you notice anything about the desegregation of the sports teams during that time?
Well, everybody knew who Frank Dowsing was, the first black man to play football here, All-American from Tupelo. And I interviewed him, did a story on him. He's deceased, as you probably know. He was an impressive man. He really was. He was bright, big. That was about the extent of it. And I did the story because he was the first. There were 2 black athletes enrolled, I think, at the same time. I don't remember the other young man's name, but he was the first to play. And he was 2 years All-American.
There was
Oh yeah.
Okay. There was a story at some point, I think it was in the 70s. It was Frank Dowsley and another guy, I don't know if it was the same one that you just mentioned, but I think his name was Larry Dillard, who was dinged on some NCAA infractions.
No, that wasn't the other. No, it wasn't. Oh, Frankie Bell. Is that right, Bell?
I don't know. I said, does that ring a bell?
No, I think Frankie Bell may have been the name of the other student.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure about that. He was a big guy in terms of being be around. Frank Dowsing was just imposing.
It might have been Larry Dillard that was.
But that name doesn't
ring a bell.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Okay, all right.
It's one of those names that if I heard it, I would say, yeah, that's it. And I'm not sure. Frankie Bell just sounds like that it was easy to find. It's in the archives, as I'm sure you know. But that was my only. I don't know, what do you say, contribution to was doing that feature story on Frank.
Don't look for that.
And it went over well, it was published widely. Frank had a very sad ending, you're probably aware of.
Well, do we have any other questions?
I can't think of any.
We'll all think of something after we.
It always happens that way. Then we'll stop then.